Welcome to Super Context, a podcast autopsy of media.
How we consume it and how it informs our everyday culture.
I'm Christian Sager, a writer and a designer.
And I'm Charlie Bennett, a librarian and a radio raconteur.
Each episode is us trying to understand the entertainment world that we all live in.
Just a little bit better.
Today's episode is about We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. This 1962 novel is being reappraised by critics and fans as a creeping meditation on 1950s housewives, agoraphobia, and good old-fashioned New England persecution.
You know a little bit about that, don't you, Chris? You can find our notes on this episode at patreon.com/supercontext, where you can leave a comment, or you can write us an email at supercontextpodcast@gmail.com. What do you think of Shirley Jackson? Have you read all of her work, or just The Lottery?
Charlie, I want to start today's episode with a quote from a book that I read that's totally unrelated to the book that we're about to talk about, but that I've been obsessed with lately, and that I'm gonna,
Okay, that sounds like a good way to start.
I'm going to talk to you about it in a mini-sode coming up, so patrons will be able to hear more about this book.
Oh, nice plug, man. I like that.
This quote resonated with me and made me think about We Have Always Lived in the Castle. This is from Sam McFeeters, and he wrote a nonfiction book that's called Mutations, The Many Strange Faces of Hardcore Punk. This is about being a punk, but I think it's something that anybody can relate to, whether or not they're a punk or not. Quote, "There are no more secret allies, no one to even commiserate with. The overculture is omnipresent, and the us versus them of yesteryear feels a lot like me versus all. It's a system that seemingly evolved to make us each despair in isolation."
Oh, that's unsettling.
So this is from a chapter in his book that is about the difference between listening to music in public spaces and listening to pop music, like radio pop music. And it's not one of the better chapters in the book, I'll be honest. But he makes a really interesting point that for people like him, and I think myself, and maybe you as well, like in the 90s and earlier, it used to feel like you were in secret clubs, and that there were like signifiers that you would see out in public that you could look at somebody and be like, I think they're also in the secret club.
Right.
And he's saying that doesn't exist anymore. That like all the secret club stuff, all the niche subcultural communities have been absorbed into mainstream culture now. So that like you may see somebody and think like, oh, they might listen to the same music as I do, or oh, they may read the same books that I do. They may understand why I feel isolated, and they don't, or it turns out like those signifiers don't have the same value anymore.
Yeah, so not having read it, I'm kind of coming into this like, well, I think this, and but I'm going to run with it. What I hear in that is the on-demand nature of communication and community, kind of changing things from a oh, hey, I'm finding out in the world people who agree with me or connect with me, is moving into it's me and my feeds, the folks that I have filter bubbled myself, next to, but it's still me against everyone else. And the ways that we make those connections have been sort of co-opted, compromised, or corporatized in such a way that now it's like, oh yeah, sign up for the email list using your Gmail account.
Right. Right. Yeah. I think what he's talking about is that like he used to feel like, well, I have a community and that's the us, and it's us versus everybody else.
Yeah.
And now he doesn't even feel like he has a community. He just feels like he's by himself and everybody is crazy. And I identify with that in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So just to pick at it a little bit, like what's the difference between us versus them and us versus all? Because in a way, you just said that, like, I've got my community and it's us versus everybody. So what happens that changes the us to me for you?
I think
that's a lot of pronouns
for
and
me,
I
and I think also for Sam McFeeters after reading the book. And I don't want to get too far into this, but I think it's a matter of, as you get older, you realize that the ties that kept you in a quote community are imaginary. And that like you actually didn't have as much in common with those people as you thought you did, or that the very idea of community based on these subcultural reasons is kind of farcical in the first place. But for me, I put this down in the notes in quotes: Unabomber temptation.
I feel like I understand that completely because I know you.
Yeah.
Some people might not, though. So why don't you expand on your Unabomber temptation? Because I believe, Chris, and please don't correct me if I'm wrong, I believe your Unabomber temptation is not that you want to kill people.
Exactly. Oftentimes my wife and I will be talking about what I would do if she died. And usually it revolves around me like going and living in the woods or in a van somewhere, right, and not being around any human being.
You understand that those are two very different things, right?
I do, yeah.
Going off to live in the woods or live in a van,
hey,
even if it's down by the river.
Not in Portland. But the idea here, though, is that, like it's extremely tempting to me, the idea of like just completely cutting ties with society and just going off and living alone and just fending for myself. There's like, and I think that this is something that a lot of people can relate to. I don't think it's like crazy that I think that.
Yeah, and we need now to place this recording in time. This is super context in the time of coronavirus. You and I have both been self-isolated for at least a week, I think. Maybe me a little less than a week, but you have been... How long have you been in your house? How long have you been unibombing it with your wife?
I have only been leaving the house to walk my dogs for the last week. Yeah.
Yeah.
Last Wednesday was the last time I went out and went record shopping and stuff.
Gotcha. It has been 5 days since I went anywhere. We are very simply homeschooling our kids at this point. A workbook page in the morning, workbook page in the afternoon. I am really starting to feel a rewiring of my brain just in this period. Hey, I'm not going to leave the house. So, if I have a moment of like, oh man, I really would love some corn chips. Well, I'm not going to have those. It's not a question of, do I really want to put my shoes on and go to the gas station? It's just straight up, you're not going to do that. So, and also we are together in a non-vacation environment.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
With each other. And it's really making a kind of beautiful and supremely annoying kind of homesteading.
I was going to say, give it another couple days / weeks.
No. It's already there. I mean, look, everybody's already had some kind of freak out at one point or another.
Yeah.
But we don't get to decide to bail.
Right. Yeah.
We don't get to say, well, you know what? If you're going to be a dick, I'm gone.
Yeah.
Or
because where are you going to go?
Yeah. Or child, you have to stop doing that, or you're going to have to go down the street. There's none of that, right? So there's actually something good about the. And now here's where I go to a larger point that I didn't know I was going for. We have to work it out with each other, which is something that's been a lot less present recently in society, of having to work it out with each other.
I think that's a really good way to put it, Charlie. Yeah, you really hit the nail on the head there. That like we as a society have been avoiding. So if in terms of conflict resolution, we've been opting for avoidance instead of collaboration or
the
compromise.
Avoidance. Sorry to talk all over you, but I'm like really excited something about this. The avoidance shouldn't be understood as a kind of, oh, I don't want to deal with it. It's more like we've been able to create our own defined structures and community.
Yeah.
With only a few geographic or vocational things requiring you to just roll with it. Like my kids go to the school they go to, and I work at the place I work. But pretty much everything else, I have had some control over.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I've suddenly lost a lot of control, but it's more I've lost control because I can't leave the house. But now my house is totally mine. It is my castle, you know? Mm-hmm. And I haven't always lived in the castle, just to have fun with the title of the Jackson book. But now I'm starting to feel like what it might be if I did always live in the castle.
Well, so this is what's interesting, right? And let's segue into the actual book. We've spent 10 minutes talking about other stuff. We scheduled this episode a couple weeks ago, not knowing how thematically it was going to resonate with world events. And it's, really hitting home. I watched the movie version of this last night to get a refresher because I read it, 6 months ago or something like that.
I have to imagine the shininess of a contemporary movie was very different from the sort of sepia tones of the book itself.
Yeah, it was. And I don't want to spend a ton of time analyzing the movie, but they changed some stuff at the end as well, I think, to make it have like a little bit more oomph with modern audiences.
Does Mary Cat go down to the village and kill everyone?
Close. You're close. So this is a 1962 novel by Shirley Jackson. It's the last novel that she published. It's not the last. I have in here, it says her last work. I think she published a short story or something like that afterward. She started a new novel and she never finished it. This is a book that we were talking about this off air before we started recording, that is by somebody who I think is considered a classic American author now, but not as many people have read it as have read, say, The Lottery, which is a short story by her that pretty much everybody is required to read in like high school or early college.
At least one critic, and we'll talk about this more, has said that she's only famous for a single short story.
Which I thought was interesting because, like, she, within the horror community that I, participate in, I guess, as a writer, she's regarded as like one of the most important, influential authors of the world.
I certainly didn't think for a moment that she was somehow only important because of The Lottery. I thought that she was someone that I did not have enough experience of.
Yeah, and I think that's most people's case with her. Before I read this, I had only read The Lottery, and I read The Haunting of Hill House in college. And I have recently gotten into her other stuff. I got a collection of hers called Let Me Tell You, that is a bunch of her short stories and short nonfiction articles that were published in like women's magazines in the like 50s and 60s. And so I've been kind of slowly making my way through that. And it's just fascinating. When this episode is about this book, but it's also about her career in a way. Yeah,
there's a ton of shit that I had no idea about before we got into this. So let's get into it.
Yeah.
Shirley Jackson, born in 1916 in San Francisco, lived to 65, and that's a short life. She is best known for horror and occult stories, although that doesn't seem to really render her precisely, because what she did was Gothics. She did, everyday backgrounds, a very matter-of-fact, almost comedy kind of writing about terrible things. And there are ghosts in some of her stories. When you said, let's do We Have Always Lived in the Castle, I said, oh, cool, a ghost story.
Yeah.
And you were like, no, it feels like that, but it is not.
I thought the same thing when I started reading it. And so when I finished it, I was like, oh, wow, this is amazing. There's nothing supernatural in this book. And it's she's just a fascinating case of how an incredibly talented writer is mistreated both by the immediate people around her and by the publishing industry. And yet, like, it's only now 60 years later, 50 years later, that we're like starting to come around and like really appreciate her entire body of work.
Yeah. I have this shorthand in my head these days. I don't know if you remember a sea monster when you were watching Hap and Leonard.
No, I don't.
So a boat flips in Hap and Leonard.
Oh yeah, they think it's an alligator.
Your first reaction was a sea monster because you expected some horror from
because of Lansdale. Yeah. So
whenever there's a moment like that where someone says, oh, this thing is going to be like this because of the creator. I have in my head that's a sea monster moment.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. She's definitely not a sea monster type. I mean, I would say even The Haunting of Hill House, the ghosts of Haunting of Hill House are kind of, they take a back seat to the actual like psychological thriller of what's going on between the living human beings that are in the house together.
Yeah. So we need to get this started right now about Jackson.
Yeah.
There's a bunch about her life that has not been part of any, critique of the lottery or discussion of Haunting of Hill House or anything like that I've heard. It turns out that she was deeply troubled,
Yeah.
and in a lot of pain, psychological and physical, most of her life. She was physically unhealthy, a heavy smoker. She suffered from asthma, joint pain, exhaustion, dizziness, had a heart problem. She saw a psychiatrist for severe anxiety. Can't even say it. She was housebound. She had agoraphobia. She was prescribed barbiturates and amphetamines for two different disorders, which then meant that basically she was a drug addict battling it out on both sides.
Yep.
Her mother was abusive in the most classic gothic shitty way. Like Maria Bamford's mom taken to the moon,
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Why can't you be a good girl? Why have I been saddled with someone who won't be the way they're supposed to be? And then she recapitulated that in her marriage to an abusive, patriarchal dickhead.
Yep.
And on top of that, she lived in like Vermont, right next to, your people. And felt isolated and removed and discarded and trapped.
She lived in North Bennington, Vermont, and when I first read this book, I didn't recognize it. But then when I was doing the research yesterday and when I watched the movie version, I was like, oh, this is the New England that I grew up in. I remember this. Like the way that people behave, the agoraphobia of living in a small town and feeling like you're the other, and then just like the way in which Jackson captures something that my wife refers to as "you think you're better than me," Massachusetts, which is like a very like blue collar attitude versus like upper class kind of snobbyish Kennedyisms in here. It's fascinating
to find out that the lottery was a sort of rendering of her feeling that the town would discard her for its own good in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
Blew my mind. And she also had the problem, or the town had the problem, of her being married to Stanley Edgar Hyman, who was a Jewish professor. And so anti-intellectualism, anti-Semitism, and the sort of marginalization of her as a quote-unquote faculty wife, all contributed to her being something that I know existed, but sometimes disappears from my head and then comes slamming back when we, look at stuff like this. She was a 1950s housewife, which is not a joke. Right. That is a real thing in terms of a bad situation that a lot of middle-class white women found themselves in and suffered from hardcore.
Yeah, and it turns out that the way in which Jackson was writing is seen by a lot of people as a precursor to 1970s feminism, in how she was trying to claw her way out of that existence, and she was doing it through her writing. And then it's even more interesting, and we'll get into this later, feminist critiques of her and her peers started popping up in the 70s, basically saying like, this person is part of the problem. And so there's a really interesting retrospective look at a book like We Have Always Lived in the Castle, because it's essentially like, well, how does this book handle female representation, and like what are the themes, and are the themes positive for modern female readers?
Right. So let's go straight to Jackson. She said, "When I first used to write stories and hide them away in my desk, I used to think that no one had ever been so lonely as I was, and I used to write about people all alone. I thought I was insane, and I would write about how the only sane people are the ones who are condemned as mad, and how the whole world is cruel and foolish and afraid of people who are different."
Wow.
Yeah, I felt that one pretty hard.
Yeah, me too. It's
and
brutal.
Also recognized in the face of that how little right I had to think that when I was thinking that kind of stuff compared to the life that she was living. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a really good piece that we'll have a link to on the landing page. It's by Zoe Heller, and it's in the New Yorker, and it is technically a review of a biography on Shirley Jackson, but it turns into its own kind of mini biography that I think is helpful for situating us within this book. Zoe Heller talks more about the relationship with the mother. Her mother's name was Geraldine, and Zoe Heller refers to her as an elegant, rather vapid woman who was disappointed by her daughter, made it clear that she would have preferred a prettier, more pliable one. She told Jackson she was the product of a failed abortion, and harangued her constantly about her bad hair, her weight, and her willful refusal to cultivate feminine charm.
Listen to this. After Jackson became a known writer, her mom would send her letters saying, "Your fiction is repetitious. Your style of living is helter-skelter." And here's a quote. "I have been so sad all morning about what you have allowed yourself to look like."
Yeah, it's brutal. We should mention that even though most of her adult life was in New England, Shirley Jackson was from California originally. So I think
San Francisco.
That's where her mother was probably based, and she was getting these letters from. So we can't pin all of this on New England culture, although, again, this sounds very familiar. So there's this argument that Jackson as an adult was constantly rebelling against her mom and her mother's values. That's why she was a writer. That's why she let herself, gain weight. She married a Jewish intellectual. She, quote, ran a bohemian household where she dyed the mashed potatoes green whenever she felt like it.
Okay, so pause.
Yeah.
She dyed the mashed potatoes green when she felt like it, I guess, instead of only on St. Patrick's Day.
I would have to assume, yeah.
And so a bohemian household, in terms of her mom, in terms of what she was brought up to be, is by not doing things based on manners, politeness, and the standards of the community, but instead to just do what you felt like doing.
So it's interesting, right? Because she was really struggling to try to get out from underneath that, and yet she ended up underneath like the heel of another repressive person in her life, which was her husband. We'll get into that shortly. But these are the conditions that she was writing under. Like, she was a housewife with, I think, 3 kids, maybe 4 kids.
It was 4 I don't know where they were spaced in her life and her career, but she had 4 kids altogether.
So she was expected to get up, clean house, maintain the domesticity of their household, get the kids off to school, etc. And then in the, minutes and maybe hours in between, the downtime is when she wrote these novels and short stories.
Yeah.
And her husband didn't take her work seriously, even after she eclipsed him as a professional.
He took it oddly seriously. Listen to this motherfucker. Jackson and Hyman met at Syracuse after he found her because he read her first published story, saying, "I'm going to marry the author of this story." Zoe Heller says, to Jackson, who had already begun to experience the anxiety, depression, and fears of people that plagued her throughout her life, Hyman seemed a savior, a brilliant man who didn't think she was ugly, who understood her and loved her, who believed in her promise as a writer. His main drawback was his principled insistence on sleeping with other women.
Lovely.
He expected Jackson to listen good-naturedly to accounts of his sexual adventures. He was a libertine, polyamorous abuser. If this turns you queasy, you are a fool, he said.
He said that to her.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is where I want to put a stake down. I have no problem with polyamorous relationships. I think the problem here is that this was not consensual.
Yeah, and if anybody felt that I was saying if you are polyamorous, you're an abuser, that's not what I'm saying.
Right.
I'm saying that those things all coupled up. He was a libertine. He decided to be unfaithful consistently on principle.
Yeah.
Like, this is how I'm going to live my life. And he was an abuser. And all that turned into a no consent, no discussion, no empathy situation at home.
Jackson's biographer describes this. She says that Jackson was primed by her mother's criticisms to accept being in a relationship with a man who treated her disrespectfully and shamed her for legitimate and rational desires.
Now,
so she had a tough life. It wasn't pleasant.
It makes total sense that she would be a drug user or abuser and an alcoholic. And it's shocking that she was, because the work is so careful and coherent. It's not like she was writing monologues or weird like beat poetry that was untrained. She seemed to be a really conscientious and practiced artist.
Yeah.
And so to find out that her life was in shambles, that her headspace was so devastated, is astonishing to me.
Yeah, but then when you step back and you look at the body of work, you can see how a lot of it is a cry for help, especially this book.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Although for me, it was always, the idea of it was that, oh, Shirley Jackson must have been a really, independent, strong-willed, sort of fuck you all kind of lady who was writing about what other people were experiencing. I just assumed that she was like outside of it and able to see it, as opposed to being inside it and still being able to very carefully express it.
Hey, we are 30 minutes into this episode and we haven't told people what this book is about. So there's, maybe an assumption on our part that everybody has read this and knows what it's about. Do you want to give a stab at like a synopsis?
Well, yeah, okay. It's a very simple story, Chris. A family dies, except for a few people, and they stay in the house, and everyone hates them, and they deal with that.
Yeah, pretty much. And then the hate grows and grows and grows until it causes an incredibly violent incident that makes everybody rethink their lives.
Yeah, it's a beautiful fairy tale about how a couple of witches come to be.
Yeah. So, that's the non-spoiler version. We might get into some spoilers down the road, folks, because there's some close reading analysis of how things that happen in the book.
This is a very good time to say, if you are interested in reading the book, there are some joys to being surprised by some of the revelations, and to learn what kind of book you're reading as you really get deeper and deeper into it. So now would be a perfect time to say, I'm going to go read that book. It's not a long book. It's not a totally short book, but it's a quick read. It's really lovely.
So
okay,
back to Jackson and
if you're still sticking with us, let's go for it.
These are the circumstances Jackson was writing "We Have Always Lived in the Castle" under. Ready for this quote? Jackson,
I'm not, but okay.
She did all the cooking, the cleaning, the grocery shopping, and the child rearing in their household. Her husband sat at his desk, quote, pondering the state of American letters and occasionally yelling at her to come and refill the ink in his pen.
His brother Arthur once commented that Hyman's views on the domestic division of labor were the only aspects of his traditional Jewish upbringing that he had retained.
So there was a point where, like, she was selling these short stories to magazines. Her novels started getting published. She started becoming the family's, quote, chief breadwinner. She was making more money than he was.
And yet he still applied the principles of male-dominated households by holding on to the money and giving her an allowance from her income.
And he talked down to her. Remember, he's a literary critic, so he talked down to her about her work. He characterized her to their friends as a gifted idiot who composed her fiction in a trance state of automatic writing and had to take it to him to have it explained back to her.
Jesus.
And all throughout this, he continued to have extramarital affairs, mainly with his former students.
So this guy sucked in every way, and this would have been a perfect Mad Men bottle episode.
Yeah.
You know, if Don and one of his wives went out to visit, you know, an old teacher, you know, Professor Hyman, and discovered that Shirley Jackson was there.
Yeah.
This is totally the stuff that they were trying to get at in the historical fiction of Mad Men.
Despite, like, you know, her troubled life and ultimately, like, I think most people agree that's probably why she died young, Jackson seemed to be aware of what was going on. She said, "I wrote of neuroses and fear, and I think all of my books, when you lay them end to end, are just one long documentation of anxiety."
You know, this is the one piece of her that seems not to match up. Like, she's portrayed, you know, with careful research, she's portrayed as this person who was chaos inside and out. And yet her self-awareness and her work don't seem like a chaotic person.
Right. Yeah. She seems like somebody who is incredibly self-aware, and not only of herself, but also of her surroundings, and is able to put that thematically into her stories. So let's zoom in on We Have Always Lived in the Castle. So the two main characters in this book are sisters who live in this, I don't know if I'd call it a mansion, but it's a nice, like, big,
would this be a
house.
manor?
Yeah, maybe a manor
on an estate.
So the sisters are Constance, who I think is in her early 20s, and Maricat, who is 18. And Jackson describes these two characters as being two halves of the same person, and many people see them as being two halves of her personality. So you have the, quote, potent, angry woman. And you see this apparently in Jackson's, like, letters to her friends. And then there is, you know, the Constance is the homemaker who's just trying to make everybody happy and constantly smiling.
I'm so sad, Chris, that you've jumped over this little tidbit.
Oh, go for it.
When Shirley Jackson referred to her angry, potent woman side, she would call herself Snarly Shirley.
Yeah, or Charlie.
Charlie.
Yeah. And so this is interesting. This is where we start getting into the complications with Betty Friedan, who was a noted second wave feminist. Betty Friedan used Jackson as an example, as sort of the honestly, she referred to Jackson as the Uncle Tom of feminism, as if Jackson were part of the problem.
That's some hardcore shit right there.
Yeah. And Friedan described her as a, quote, virtual schizophrenic, a woman, and Franklin says this, pressured by the media and the commercial culture to deny her personal and intellectual interests and be subsumed in her identity into her husband's.
All of Jackson's work, Franklin writes, is animated by the tension she felt between her socially sanctioned role as a happy homemaker and her vocation as a writer. Thus, it, quote, constitutes nothing less than the secret history of American women of her era. And I find that so weird that this then makes Friedan say, oh, she was part of the problem. You know, an Uncle Tom, if you take it like, not literally, but in the, take it directly.
Yeah.
That means someone who was subservient, overly so, to the social order, the oppressive social order, to both put themselves at a good position, but also because they can't think of anything else. And I feel like that does not describe the way that Shirley Jackson was investigating this stuff. Even if her home life was kind of like, you're putting up with this, she was clearly delivering in her fiction portraits against that kind of life.
Yeah, her fiction reads to me now the way when there is like a dictatorship in a country, and the literature that's produced under that dictatorship is writing about it, but using symbolism that the dictator themselves wouldn't understand.
Yeah.
And so therefore, like, I'm thinking of like the Czech Republic, or what was Czechoslovakia under the Soviet Union, these ideas that if you use symbols that were localized, that the like overarching power system, and in Shirley Jackson's case, it's her husband, wouldn't understand what it was actually about.
And willfully misunderstand the purpose of the art.
Yeah, yeah. And it turns out, like, other feminists like Betty Friedan were also misreading this.
Now, I should say at this moment, having not read the full criticism that Friedan has against Shirley Jackson, and having not read Shirley Jackson, I am, except for this book and the lottery, I am coming from a place of reading the summary of someone's argument and then having some sort of immediate kind of, oh, that doesn't sound right because of this, this, and this.
Yeah,
so
I'm sure it's far more complicated than we're presenting it.
And I am recognizing by digging into this book how little of that cliche that I believe in, the 50s housewife suffering, that I actually know, or that I have really tried to take in as a direct communication. Mm-hmm. Meaning, yes, I read The Yellow Wallpaper, which sort of sets the foundation for this kind of...
Wow, I was just about to bring it up. Yeah.
That sets the foundation for this kind of breakdown or chaotic mental state.
Yeah.
And I've read this book now, and probably a couple other stories like this, except not nearly enough, and certainly not memoirs that really lay it out for me. And I'm learning, Chris, how little I know about anything.
Well, one thing I didn't know was that the minute this book was published, which was in September of 1962, Shirley Jackson had a nervous breakdown. Her agoraphobia got worse. She didn't leave her house for half a year. So now you see, people, why we were talking about how this is related to the coronavirus situation. She, quote, said, "I have written myself into the house." It took her 2 years to recover from this agoraphobia. She wasn't able to write. Then at the end of the period, she started to recover. She was trying to write fiction again. She was hoping to leave her husband.
And this is from a journal that people have been able to refer to that she wrote in this time.
Yeah.
She was looking forward to leaving her husband. She was planning on, quote, "to be separate, to be alone, to stand and walk alone, not to be different and weak and helpless and degraded."
She started speculating on what life would be like away from her husband and living as a writer, because she was making a pretty good living at it. She wrote this in that journal: "If I am cured and well and, oh glorious, alive, then my books should be different. Who wants to write about anxiety from a place of safety? Although I suppose I would never be entirely safe, since I cannot completely reconstruct my mind. But what conflict is there to write about then? I keep thinking vaguely about husbands and wives, perhaps in suburbia, but I do not really think that this is my kind of thing. Perhaps it'll be a funny book, a happy book. Plots will come flooding when I get the rubbish cleared away from my mind."
And she did start another book, which is categorized as a funny, happy novel in which a recently widowed woman abandons her old name and embarks on a new life. It's almost like the setup for a sitcom.
Yeah, except, unfortunately, Jackson didn't live to finish it. And so the last words that are written in her journal, and this is 6 months before she died, suggest that she was desperately trying to persuade herself to be optimistic. And she wrote this: "I am the captain of my fate. Laughter is possible. Laughter is possible. Laughter is possible."
She died in her sleep of heart failure at 48.
It's really tragic. Like, I've been reading her stuff for a while now, and like using her as somewhat of a barometer, to hold other psychological horror writers up against, and not really knowing how tragic her life was. It's very sad.
Yeah. We got a quote here from Boyd Tonkin, writing in The Independent. "Seen from a distance, Jackson's life looks almost like a lazy screenwriter's pastiche of the female Gothic author's plight. A busy homemaker confined in a creepy old New England house, raising 4 kids while her husband makes his name as a public intellectual and arbiter of taste. Not so much the madwoman in the attic as the sorceress at the sink, she rustles up deeply unsettling tales of mythic fury and supernatural power in between making breakfast, laundry, and shopping trips. So, I mean, that does make sense that if you take these facts and really isolate them from any sort of lived life, it does sound like, oh, are you just trying to write a story about this time? Are you reaching for the easy symbolisms?
David Barnett wrote about her in The Guardian, and he said that at the end of her life she was troubled, which we've mentioned in detail, but that this book is like this expression, basically, of the yin and yang of her inner self. So you've got Maricat, this explorer, she's challenging everybody, and then you've got Constance, who is content, this domestic homebody. And it's just it's setting the stage essentially for the conflict that's going on inside her, and that seems to have really been difficult for her to come to grips with up until the end of her life.
And this book, which could be about 2 women dealing with how a town has isolated them, and sort of lashing out or trying to figure out how to live better, or to I had this feeling the whole time I was reading it. I was waiting for the really dangerous, almost psychotic kind of behavior by the women, Maricat and Constance, to then bleed out into the town, and for people to get what was coming to them for being so shitty, and for kind of a self-immolation of these 2 main characters.
That would be the Stephen King version.
Exactly, yeah. And I'm pretty sure that's part of my programming, because he definitely read this kind of stuff.
Oh, he's super influenced by her.
Did his own things, yeah.
Yeah.
But instead, it was very much in Maricat is Mary, but in Maricat's head, as she tried to create a world, like an almost OCD style magical world, a symbolic and what's that ritual kind of magic sort of life that would keep her safe and keep her sister safe and keep the world from continuing from the moment of trauma of this night that most of her family was poisoned by what people assume was her sister putting arsenic in the sugar bowl.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is complicated stuff, because it not only does it resonate with us being trapped in the house right now, but it resonates, I would imagine, with many women across the last, I don't know, thousands of years. But then on top of all of that, you've got Shirley Jackson's legacy and how she's treated within the publishing industry. And Zoe Heller in her New Yorker piece points out that there's a big difference between 2 biographies that are written about Jackson. There's the Ruth Franklin one that we've been talking about, and then there's another one by Judy Oppenheimer that came out in 1988, and that one's called Private Demons, and it plays up that Jackson had, quote, occult powers, and so it sounds like
this come from.
I think there's a lot more of the leaning into the Jackson was a witch stuff, and Franklin says, no, we need to step back and we need to see her for what she is, and that she has been relegated to the corner of literature because of sexists, but also because of genre snobs who think horror isn't legitimate literature. That she's, quote, been consigned to a dungeon of kooky, spooky middle brownness. And there's this interesting thing. Franklin says, this is a thing I never knew about Shirley Jackson. Shirley Jackson would talk about being witchy, but she was joking, according to Franklin. She says it's like Alan Moore. She would say, yeah, this was her sorceress persona, and it was mostly a shtick. It was a fun way for her to tease interviewers and to sell books. Jackson was interested in witchcraft, but it was less as a practical method for influencing the world and more as a way of embracing and channeling her female power at a time when women often had little control over their lives.
Yeah, and Franklin points out that the supernatural, gothic, or witchy qualities of Jackson's fiction was a strategy. She invokes Poe and James, saying that the supernatural or seemingly supernatural stuff in Jackson's writing is meant to, quote, plumb the depths of the human condition and explore the psychic damage to which women are especially prone.
So that we can add this as yet another reason for, quote, why horror? When people say, why would you read that stuff? And a lot of people say that about Shirley Jackson. Why would you bother with that? I don't want to read about haunted houses.
So just to bring this bit to a close then, before we start talking about which big five published this, the book itself it's full of sort of unsatisfying plot points, but it works as a fairy tale-ish portrait of a moment. There's a lot of stuff in it that to me felt like it was leaning one way. Like, oh, we're leaning towards a revenge. Oh, we're leaning towards some kind of cathartic, violent, bloody finish to this life. Or, oh, there's going to be a big throwdown between these two characters. But instead, it's a very incremental change from a position of contained anxiety and trouble to a completely transformative place of not isolation but hermitude, of Unabomberness, of blooming into the image that people have of these girls, meaning to say, instead of it being about a woman who is struggling with the image that she is being put into and then sort of working out her life, it's instead like the only way out is through. Someone becomes so much the outsider, so much the occult, supernatural, chaotic, scary part of the world embodied in a woman that then the place that they live actually becomes the haunted house of the village. Yeah.
So actually, this is a good point for me to maybe talk a little bit about the movie, which I just watched last night.
Okay. Yeah.
We'll bring it up later, but that's what the movie gets wrong about this story. They change a couple of things so that instead of having that subtle, gradual progression into this is how the town's like boogeyman was created, essentially.
Right.
It does turn into a revenge story. So in the film, Maricat murders Charlie.
Hey, easy there, Chris.
She murders
easy.
You. She kills him at the end.
Okay.
Which does not happen in the book, if I'm remembering it correctly.
No, it doesn't even remotely happen.
She bludgeons him to death and caves his head in.
Okay.
And then the villagers, during the burning of the house, the villagers drag her and Constance out front and are about to physically assault them when they're stopped by a guy shooting a gun into the air. And I was like, whoa.
Yeah,
none of this happened.
That's the opposite of everything that Shirley Jackson was writing.
Yeah. So I thought the movie was pretty good, but I was disappointed that the creator of the film was obviously they felt like there needed to be that catharsis,
some kind of satisfaction.
Yeah.
So the movie was a better movie if you hadn't read the book.
I think it probably would have been fine. Yeah. I was surprised how up until that point it was remarkably faithful, because I would have said if I did say this, I think, to you when the movie first came out a couple of years ago. I was like, that seems like an unfilmable novel. I'm surprised that they're doing it.
It is an unfilmable novel, unless you add in some instantiations of the psychological violence.
Yeah. Okay, back to the book. So the book was published by Viking Press.
Hey, Stephen King's publisher.
Yeah. Well, one of them. And well, let's just do our normal super context thing and just give some background on this to give an idea of like who was partnering with Shirley Jackson and selling her work. So Viking Press is an American publishing company. It wasn't when Shirley Jackson worked for them, but it is now owned by Penguin Random House.
Penguin Random House, as of 2016, was the biggest of the big five. I don't know if that's changed.
Is that right?
Yeah.
In 1925 was when Viking Press was founded. So you've got like a 50-year window where they're an independent company, because in 1975, Penguin Random House acquired them. This is a list of authors that they are known for publishing. Don DeLillo, Graham Greene, James Joyce, Jack Kerouac, Arthur Miller, John Steinbeck, Kingsley Amis, Hannah Arendt, William S. Burroughs, Stephen King, David Foster Wallace, and Thomas Pynchon. That is like a...
Yowza.
That's a batting cage full of very talented people, or at least well-renowned people. So it is yet again kind of an interesting idea that Jackson, despite having a publisher behind her that clearly has invested time in, what would you say, like cultivating big-name authors, is still, relegated to this corner as, oh, she's just a horror writer.
Yeah, despite being part of a crew at a publisher that seemed to be American culture producers.
Yeah. Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to dive into the respect that this book does have, how it's been received by reviewers and audiences alike, and then we'll get a little bit deeper into the themes and the representation of women in the book. I don't know if it's occurred to you, Charlie, but we are now ending Super Context right in the middle of this coronavirus isolation period. We didn't intend that, but this show is going to stop somewhere toward the middle or end, or depending on how long it all goes.
The thing that's freaking me out is that people keep saying, well, it will probably get back to some kind of, opening of society by mid-April, by end of April, by May. Like, now we will finish in the midst instead of as things get back to normal, the new normal. To tell you the truth, Chris, I don't know what the fuck I'm saying anymore. So I'm going to let you continue with the Patreon spot.
I don't think anybody does, but what Charlie and I do know is that we can still record this show across the country.
That's right. We are socially distanced all the time.
And we can still rely on you to listen to it. So we appreciate that. But as a reminder, through May of 2020, our Patreon is still active. So that's, as we're recording it now, for about one more month, month and a half. I
should be very explicit. Until May 1st, 2020. So throughout the rest of March and April, we are a ongoing podcast, a going concern.
So what that means is your support is going to help us pay for our hosting fees, for our expenses, and also for the recording setup to make sure that we have better production. Oh my God, Charlie, I have been listening to some new podcasts lately, and I am ashamed of them. how poor their production value is compared to ours. And frankly, like, ours isn't that great, but like, we've put some effort into it.
I love the fact that most likely you saying that great was a peak moment with a little Skype distortion on it that I won't be able to fix. Once we get to May 1st, we're going to stop being Super Context, the weekly podcast. I think we have like one last thing to throw out into the universe at that point. But after May 1st, if you are a patron of Super Context, supporting us at any level, you will be helping keep the public RSS feed active and free, so people can still discover the show, go back to the beginning and listen to the archives, and hear how we started from just a couple of guys high on sugar, yelling at each other about stuff we liked, to this, whatever this is now.
So there are rewards available, and the rewards are going to get condensed on May 1st as well. But these are the things that you get if you're a patron of Super Context. You get access to outtakes and blooper reels. There are also bi-weekly bonus mini episodes, of which I think we have almost 40 at this point. And we will continue recording one of those a month. And there are all the monthly Super King Context episodes we've done over the last year and a half.
Yeah. So let's do that one more time. Bloopers, outtakes, bi-weekly bonus episodes, and Super King Context once a month. That's what's happening right now. After May, we will have one mini episode a month to check in with each other, make sure everything's going well, and to tell everybody what Warren Ellis comic we've read this time.
And the one thing that everybody gets is a thank you right here in this segment. So let's kick it off by thanking Alex Laird, Alice Florence, Ambrose Allen, Amit Doshi, Andy Riggs, BB Schwells, Bennett Callahan, Beth Barnett, Beth Gilmore, Billy Whitehouse, Bing Bong Man, Brandon Daniels, Brian Chovanich, and Carolyn Zoids.
And thank you to Chris Marlton, Cliff Landis, Coco, Dave Jordan, Dave Wachter, Elijah Tilstra, Evan Mapstone, Fred Rasco, Ira James Udiskin, James McDonald, Jason, another nickname, Puckett, Jim Taylor, Jess Staten, John Klima, John Pheasant, Joseph Aleo, Juan Patton, Junta/Cult, Calvin Ellis, and Carmela Padovich.
Thank you also to Kate Sharon, Kevin Wetter, Christian Hirvala, Lee Fowler, Lokesh Dakar, Luciano Fuck, Luigi Oswego, Melinda Hale, Miriam Meany, Misha Moon, Nathan Weatherford, Nick Sage, Patrick Malka, Pete Bowe, Philip, R.M. Rhodes, and the podcast Rein It In, Matt and Rachel.
And
podcasts supporting other podcasts.
Well, hey, we do that.
We do that.
And thank you to Roar Vinland, Rob Sloan, Robert Negoesco, Roman Marichik, Romantic Placebo, Ron Bilodeau, Ross Llewellyn, Ryan O'Neill, Sari Nichols, Seth Friedman, Simon Workman, Tara Mishak, Thomas Tremberger, Veal Height, and Whitney Buchanan, who I will never forget again, I promise.
If you want to join the club, go ahead and check out our Patreon at patreon.com/supercontext. And we're back. So turning back to that Zoe Heller New Yorker piece, she kind of puts things into perspective, Charlie, about,
oh, well, thank God someone did, Chris.
Someone did. That Jackson's work has been reappraised in the last, decade or so. So she's mainly known for The Lottery. We've talked about that. She is also known for the novel The Haunting of Hill House. But it's only recently that this book, which is called Beautifully Weird, is starting to become more widely read. In recent years, there's been renewed signs of interest in her work. People like Neil Gaiman, Jonathan Lethem, and A.M. Holmes have praised her, talked about how she's been an influence on them. There's been attempts to reclaim this work. This is where you, I think, got this quote from that you mentioned at the top of the episode. Yeah. When the Library of America published an edition of Jackson's selected works that was edited by Joyce Carol Oates, a critic at Newsweek wrote the following: Shirley Jackson, a writer mostly famous for one short story, is Library of America about to jump the shark?
Now, I tracked this person down.
Oh.
And I cut his throat. And Malcolm Jones is a literary critic who's written a memoir and is now writing at the Daily Beast a lot, doing things like Willie Nelson refuses to look death in the face.
Lovely.
This is mostly about me, not whether Malcolm Jones should have written that or if it's true or anything like that.
You do enjoy tracking down a shitty reviewer.
I do. And the thing was, it's like, what exactly was I looking for? And I finally found it when Jones had written a appreciation of Harper Lee.
Okay.
A woman mostly famous for one book.
Right. Yeah.
And so I think that the core of this is that Shirley Jackson arouses in people the snobbery of, horror, that's not real literary fiction, and allows people to make all kinds of conditions as to why she should be taken seriously, that they wouldn't put on someone who was already coded as literary.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Then the other swing side of the perspective, at ReaderCon every year, the Shirley Jackson Award is presented. Specifically, it's in recognition of her legacy in writing. It's awarded to outstanding achievements in the literature of psychological suspense, horror, and the dark fantastic.
We should definitely say it's pretty clear that psychological suspense is what Shirley Jackson is all about.
Yeah.
And horror and dark fantastic were tools in her toolbox.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's so I use this comparison a lot, and it might offend some people, right? Like, I think of the Golden Globes and the Oscars as like a barometer to compare these other award ceremonies. Like in comics, there's the Eisners and the Harveys. And then in horror fiction, there's the Stokers and the Shirley Jackson Award. And I think the Stokers are like, if my impression's right, the Stokers are like the Oscars of horror, and the Shirley Jacksons are like the Golden Globes.
Interesting.
That's what it feels like.
Okay. Well, let's go completely to the side of all of that and say Time Magazine, arbiter of American culture, named it one of the 10 best novels of 1962. And Book Magazine said that Mary Cat, also known as Mary Catherine, in the book was the 71st best character in fiction since 1900.
That's a bizarre listicle.
That's such baseball, man. It's like, this is the first time a horror writer has gotten to third base after their second inning hit.
Yeah. Normally we don't go through reviews, but I think there's some interesting stuff to be found in some of these reviews reflecting on this book, 50, 60 some odd years later. David Barnett in The Guardian writes about it, and he says, there isn't a shred of the supernatural in this book, though it feels like there is. It's perhaps a story of what eventually makes haunted houses so beloved from Shirley Jackson. They're echoes of violence and emotion that are imprinted on the places in which we live.
So here's something I've been thinking about since I read the book, or since I started reading it. The way that the first-person narration by Mary Cat is a little bit fucked up, right? It's a little bit like Pale Fire. Remember, like, one of the keys to Pale Fire by Nabokov, or Nabokov, whatever, is when our annotator of the poem says, there's a very loud amusement park across the street from my hotel, in the text, right? As if his thoughts were popping out from anywhere. Mary Cat seems to be doing that right from the beginning. Right?
I think she's definitely an unreliable narrator.
Yeah. And on top of that, not only is she an unreliable narrator, but she is also a completely honest, semi-psychotic, semi-fantasist, slightly crazy person. And she's just being very honest about how her head is not working quite right.
Yeah.
Without explicitly saying to us, I just want to let you know I'm damaged, deeply damaged by the things that have happened to me and what I've done to try and right them. So now
it's almost like she doesn't realize it.
Yeah. And I feel like she is what some people think Alan Moore or Grant Morrison are like.
Yeah, possibly. But like, rewatching that movie last night, it sort of reminded me like, oh, wow, the fascinating thing about this book is Cousin Charles shows up, and he's in a house literally full of crazy people. Each of them has their own psychosis and is dealing with the trauma of the poisoning in different ways. And he's just like, it's one flew over the cuckoo's nest. He's looking around like, oh my God, these people are all insane, but I desperately want their fucking money, so I'm going to put up with it.
And I should say the reason I bring up Alan Moore and Grant Morrison is because of their chaos magician sort of aspects. And Mary Cat is burying stuff and nailing things to trees and doing spells in her head, trying to declare her environment and herself safe.
Yeah, what's fascinating about her in this book, because I think this is before the terminology was used, it struck me that she was OCD, not that she was a witch, right?
Right.
She was coming up with like compulsory methods to deal with her problem.
But from the outside, it looks the same. Someone casting a spell by nailing a silver dollar nailing a book to a tree or burying a silver dollar. What's in your head doesn't make any difference to the person who sees you going through a careful ritual.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. From the outside. Jason Diamond writes about the book in Flavor Wire, and he points out something that we'll talk about later. First of all, it's a celebration of agoraphobia, which
we have always lived in the castle means we stay in the house.
Yeah. And then he reminds us this is a funny book. Like Shirley Jackson was capable of being really witty and amusing and clever. And she had like a sharp sense of humor.
Yeah. You listened to it? Did you use an audiobook?
No, I read it. Yeah.
Okay, so I read half of it and I used an audiobook to be able to, quote unquote, read the rest of it when I was traveling.
Sure. And
I didn't like it quite as much when it was being read to me because the quality of it was sort of radio playish. You know, it was a good reader who was doing different voices.
Yeah.
But they were all very, oh, Mary Cat.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Whereas in my head when I was reading it, it was a very kind of like people looking directly into the camera on sitcoms that pretend to be documentaries.
Oh, interesting.
You know? It had that kind of disjointed humor.
Yeah. Can you believe these fucking people that I'm surrounded by? Yeah.
And then Mary Cat saying that, like, can you believe this fucking guy? While she's also, you know, talking to her cat and finding 3 magic words to keep people from entering the house. Yeah. Or setting fire to a room in order to take back the house from the cousin.
There's another review in Bustle magazine that I thought was worth bringing up. Charlotte Aline says, I don't know if I was simply older and more capable of managing my own existential fears, but Shirley Jackson's slow burn horror gave me time to adjust, and Maricat's personal brand of creepiness was up my alley. This time I was into horror. She starts off the article with this whole thing of like, I've never liked horror. I've never liked horror books, movies, TV. And then she read this. This got her into horror.
And something about it, whether she was ready for horror or whether Shirley Jackson was really good at it or if she identified with the crazy main character. She was in it.
This sentence, which I thought was interesting. She says, I see horror writing as a remarkable skill now, the ability to frighten with mere words on the page without jump scares or latex masks or bleeding elevators. It was electrifying. I finally saw horror writing for the subtle art that it is, and I never looked back.
Yeah, so Shirley Jackson writes this story in which a kid poisons her family, except for her sister, on purpose.
Yeah.
Right. She doesn't poison Constance on purpose, and then she and her sister and the now disabled uncle who survived that night all live in the same house, are hated by the villagers that live below them, are losing their status as a rich family, losing their status as a member of the community, and slowly pull themselves into their home to make it the only place they are safe.
Yeah.
And none of the truth of that situation is explicitly told to us, but we learn all of that, implicitly in the really compelling mindset narration that Shirley Jackson wrote. Like, she delivers a lot of information and a lot of plot and story separate from what our narrator is actually saying to us. And it's a really well-written book because of that.
Yeah. Well, clearly it was all because of her husband, though, right, Charlie?
Yeah, it came out of her sort of like a ghost had possessed her.
Yeah, he needed to translate it for her.
She's great at writing.
She's amazing.
Yeah.
So this has since been adapted into both a stage play and a film adaptation. The stage play came out like 2 years after the book, which is kind of fascinating.
That makes sense. I mean, it might have been put out as a play. It's like the story of a young man who travels to the home of his crazy cousins to find out if he can get the money.
The film came out, or I guess was produced in 2018. It stars Sebastian Stan as Charles, Alexandra Daddario, I think is how you say her name, as Constance, Taissa Farmiga as Maricat, and then do you know who plays Uncle Julian?
Crispin Glover.
Yeah, Crispin Glover totally chews up the scenery in the movie. He's so
As
perfect.
well he should.
Yeah, he really makes it a lot of fun.
Now, I think that just for a little bit of comparison, I'm going to grab The Haunting of Hill House off of IMDb and look at how many adaptations of that have been made.
There's at least 3.
So
There's the 60s movie, there's the 90s movie, and then there's the recent Netflix miniseries.
So I've got a TV series, a movie. Okay, yeah. And then The Lottery has been adapted once, twice, 3, 4. Yeah. So We Have Always Lived in the Castle with its 2 adaptations. That makes it the 3rd most adapted Shirley Jackson work.
I'm curious, like, the more we get into this research, I'm starting to wonder, like, if somebody's going to do a biopic about her eventually, where they're like, hey, like, this is a story that needs to be told. Like, you may remember The Lottery from high school, but this is the person who wrote it.
Yeah, it seems like she could have been part of The Hours very easily.
Yeah, The Hours, which one... I'll always remember this. A friend of mine's mom watched it, and she said, yeah, it's just this movie about a woman who's sad and nobody knows why.
Yeah, nobody knows why.
Nobody knows
why. Why is this woman unhappy? Why are these 3 women unhappy? Why are these 5 women unhappy? Well, partly because someone said that movie's about a woman who's unhappy and nobody knows why. Oh my God, it's like an infinite loop, Chris.
Yep.
Okay, this is actually perfect.
Which brings us to how women are represented in media.
She wrote in that New Yorker piece, here's how not to be taken seriously as a woman writer. Use demons and ghosts and other gothic paraphernalia in your fiction. Describe yourself publicly as a, quote, practicing amateur witch and boast about the hexes you have placed on prominent publishers. God, that's awesome. We got to find some of those articles.
I would love that, yeah. I think they might be in that book I was talking about.
Yeah. Contribute comic essays to women's magazines about your hectic life as a housewife and mother. Shirley Jackson did all of these things, and during her lifetime was largely dismissed as a talented purveyor of high-toned horror stories. Virginia Werewolf, as one critic put it.
I love that. Even if it was derisive, that is a pretty awesome nickname.
Now, each of those things that Heller is saying, do this to be not taken seriously, could fit into the image of Shirley Jackson that I had. The completely made up, the unsupported vision of a badass, who was unfettered by the 50s. You totally use demons and ghosts and gothic stuff in your work. Pretend you're a witch and boast about hexes. That totally sounds like a kooky little, a Zoe Deschanel character, right?
Zoe Deschanel wishes she was as cool as Shirley Jackson.
Except maybe not, because I bet you Zoe doesn't want to be a drug addict and an alcoholic.
Oh, you don't know that.
And then, this is not a Deschanel episode. And then comic essays, in the 50s, someone who was making fun of the fact that she had a hard life at home as a housewife, that must have been subversive as hell.
Yeah, I think this is what I'm getting at, is that I think that subversive is the right way to put it, that she was really, picking away at her circumstances through this writing that was largely being ignored, both by her husband and the people reading it. And yet now we can look back at it and go, oh, wow, that was pretty clever what she was up to. Yeah.
Heller continues, the motif of a lonely woman setting out to escape a miserable family or grimly claustrophobic community and ending up, quote unquote, lost, recurs throughout Jackson's stories. So just to kind of quickly translate that into what we're talking about, Shirley Jackson wrote about these situations, but she did not write triumphant salvations. She did not write about women who got out of it and lived a good life to themselves, until the final novel that she tried to write. Sometimes a woman comes to a place of apparent refuge only to discover once she is there creeping menace or hidden evil. It's like mathematical, She wrote about being in the situation that she was in, using a bunch of different, literary figures, tropes, and Gothic imagery. But she also wrote about the sort of recreating her abusive childhood in her marriage and not letting herself get out of that.
Yeah, and another thing that is pointed out here by Heller, she notes that when you boil it down, she never gets to act on her anger, both in her stories or in real life. As we said, like the closest to being able to get revenge that Maricat has here is setting the house on fire, which is self-sabotaging.
Yeah. Heller says that Shirley Jackson was full of rage towards her husband and expressed it not only in portraits of insufferably pompous men like Charles, but also in strange revenge fantasy cartoons that showed her serving Hyman entrails for dinner or creeping up behind him with a hatchet.
That's some EC Comics shit right there.
Yeah. She once wrote Hyman a 6-page letter explaining why she would eventually divorce him.
Yeah. So Heller defines what's going on here as being, there's two tensions. One is the tension between her having to accept being a housewife and trying to fulfill her creative ambition. And the other is the tension between wanting to get out of that situation and being too frightened to leave it.
Yeah, which makes the house an incredibly important piece of of all of her stories. The house is where this shit lands, right?
Yeah.
Got to be a housewife, but also you got to have a safe home to create in, And you're the only one who can make the house a home that's safe to create in. And so if people are not helping you or are actively working against you, as Heller says, husbands, neighbors, mothers, all hell-bent on squashing and consuming those they profess to care for, then this is where the trouble is.
Jason Diamond at Flavor Wire writes about the feminism of the book in a different way. He notes, and this is something that I find frustrating as well, that when literary critics approach American fiction, they use two different kinds of adjectives to discuss female characters. They're either strong or unlikable. And he points out that those aren't particularly helpful, and it's not how we would describe most male protagonists, especially complicated ones in literature. And so he says, this is pretty interesting, like Maricat may be described as unlikable by some people. But he says, look, I read books like this because I don't want to find somebody that I'm going to sit down and have a beer with. What I'm reading it for is to be surprised and gripped and carried off, quote, like a deer downed by a pack of wolves into the woods of the author's mind.
As soon as this landed in our notes, I started thinking about strong, unlikable, and strong female characters and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And I think it's like fake news in that there was a time when someone said, oh, we're looking for strong female characters.
Oh, yeah.
Which I believe meant we're looking for female characters in stories that have agency, that have a purpose beyond being, because there has to be a wife, and seem to be actual people as opposed to plot points. And then that became somehow strong, like admirable, strong female characters that you could say to a young girl, this is who you should be like.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Until eventually we got to, they're strong or unlikable, not cardboard, or not two-dimensional. But we've lost track of the reason that someone wanted to start designating characters as strong or weak in the writing, in the work.
This gets down to terminology again, right? Like, I think a lot of people mistake what strong means. I think it originally started off as being shorthand for complicated, well-rounded female characters. And it was taken as shorthand, I think, mainly by Hollywood for a female character who kicks ass, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, there's been tons written about this. We don't need to rehash all of it, but, like, Buffy is a really good example of this, right? Or like some of the like female protagonists in like action movies in the 80s and 90s.
Linda
like,
Hamilton characters in the Terminator movies.
I mean, Linda Hamilton is actually a better example than some of the ones I was going to use. I was going to say like those Underworld movies or the Aeon Flux adaptation with Charlize Theron, right? Like those female characters like kick ass and they're quote strong and that like they win the fights that they're in, but they're still like being sexualized and they're not particularly complicated or three-dimensional. And so this is an argument for like, look at Maricat as this like incredibly well fleshed out three-dimensional character. She's not strong. She's not winning the fight against Cousin Charles.
Right.
But she's still fascinating.
Extraordinary. Yeah.
Yeah.
Diamond lays it out. He says, we have always lived in the castle is a novel of female power and the bond of sisterhood, no matter how twisted and gnarled the cord, destined to win out over the dull greed of Cousin Charles or the banalities of village life. Despite the fact that Constance is a weak person, right,
Yeah.
who relies on ritual and tradition to keep herself sane. Despite the fact that Mary Cat is a crazy person and killed a bunch of her family, they are not weak or strong in life to become interesting in the book or to fulfill Shirley Jackson's artistic purpose, but they are extraordinary to read about.
Yeah, yeah. Eric Savoy writes about this in comparison to Flannery O'Connor, actually, in a women's studies journal, and points out that readers and critics never have known what to do with Shirley Jackson because the works are, quote, individually unsettling and cumulatively disturbing in ways that resist the pointed critical finger. And so she's failed to really like gel as this like one singular thing to people, mainly because her books aren't always about the same thing, right? Like people call her horror, but I would say even between these three works that we're talking about here, applying the genre horror to them it's loose. It slides off pretty easily. But he points out, this is where we get into the Friedan stuff a little bit here. Quote, neither critical nor historical feminism has shown interest in Shirley Jackson, possibly because the feminist project, especially during the second wave, was more engaged by visionary or liberationist currents in women's writing. Indeed, there is no overt feminist thought in Jackson's work, and still less if there is anything celebratory or redemptive in her claustrophobic fiction. If Jackson's recurring preoccupation with poisonous mother-daughter relationships was troubling to feminist scholars, her domestic writing was dismissed easily as being retrograde, leading us to The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. So Friedan was critiquing, let's put this in like a larger context, because we've just been kind of saying that she's been aiming her crosshairs at Shirley Jackson, and I think she was one of many. Betty Friedan was writing a critique about the cultural economy of women's magazines and of the women who wrote for them. And Friedan called this also the women editors who sold themselves as a bill of goods, and that there was this new breed of women writers who wrote about themselves as if they were, quote, just housewives who reveled in the comic world of children's pranks and eccentric washing machines and parents' night at the PTA.
All right, let's see if we can understand that like right now. Friedan was she was critiquing women who bought into the larger framework of how women were understood at the time, in order to make like small, subversive, fulfilling kind of artistic moves. That they were creative and expressing themselves, but they were doing so in a way that made it clear that they were still just housewives doing a little bit of fun stuff inside the presumed role that they were in.
Yeah, this is that argument that even irony is just laughing at the bars of the cage that you're in. right? And that, like, maybe I haven't read these Shirley Jackson pieces, but it sounds to me like they were kind of whimsical, like ironic pieces about how frustrating it was to be a housewife. And Friedan is saying, yeah, you're not taking us anywhere further with this. You're not challenging us. You're just laughing at your own predicament.
Yeah. Presenting quiet desperation as opposed to empowerment. Self-abnegation is what Friedan said that this kind of thing is. By portraying the trauma, portraying what was a problem for her without a solution, I think Friedan imagined that Shirley Jackson was contributing to the oppression as opposed to alleviating it.
Yeah, yeah. Here it is. This is a direct Friedan quote, actually. So I mentioned this earlier, but she was the one who originally said this. She referred to Shirley Jackson as a, quote, housewife writer, and she said, it's not funny. It's like Uncle Tom or Amos and Andy.
Jesus. When Shirley Jackson, she says, who all her adult life has been an extremely capable writer pursuing a craft far more demanding than bed making, along with a couple other writers, picture themselves as housewives, they implicitly deny the vision and the satisfying hard work involved in their stories, poems, and plays. They deny the lives they lead, not as housewives, but as individuals. And then she makes the Uncle Tom or Amos and Andy comparison. She basically says they are caricaturing themselves to be accepted by patriarchal society. Yeah. And from a distance, from a historical distance, me reading Shirley Jackson's We've Always Lived in the Castle, I feel like it's a harsh critique, an extraordinary rendition of a mental state.
Which makes me wonder, I haven't read the Friedan thing thoroughly. I'm reading this summary of it. But it seems to me like Friedan knew her mainly for her nonfiction pieces in women's magazines and didn't know about this stuff or The Haunting of Hill House.
Yeah. So Savoy does come to Jackson's defense.
Yeah.
And says, I would argue that Shirley Jackson, in novels that range from the psychological realism of The Bird's Nest to the gothic disintegration of the subject in The Haunting of Hill House, literalizes what Friedan understood figuratively as schizophrenia, and which our culture is more likely to understand as dissociative identity disorder or the psychopathology of multiple personalities. While Jackson explores the conflicting identities of the female subject in terms that are poetic and psychoanalytic rather than expository and sociological, the centrality of women characters in her fiction and the profound conflicts they experience arise from her preoccupation with female gendering in terms that are not far removed from Friedan's. So if I can try and get that right, Friedan and Jackson to Savoy are working on the same stuff, but Jackson is doing the kind of artistic trick, of making up a kind of personal code and delivering that in the frame of a story. Mm-hmm. And Savoy says, throughout Jackson's fictional implotments, what a word, the trials of female relationality to family, to mothers, to male power and privilege, and to medical control are her field of representation, i.e., Jackson is dealing with all of the stuff that Friedan says she should be dealing with.
Yeah.
And she's doing it under cover of being a housewife who writes.
Yeah. So I think this is maybe the difference here. Is Friedan's argument is that you have to be overt about it. And Shirley Jackson, within the situation of her life, had to be subversive about it. She didn't feel like she could be overt about it. Maybe that's what she was looking to get to if she had lived and divorced her husband and gone off and lived this other lifestyle that she dreamed of.
Well, also, Jackson was a writer living. She was not a feminist activist.
Yeah.
She had not made the decision to fight the power, and Friedan had.
So let's pick up here with the last article in the representation section. This is from Plowshares, which I believe is out of Emerson College in Boston.
Yeah, that's exactly where it's from.
And it's by Jane Tracy. Again, writing about this book specifically, but Tracy points out that there are these prominent female writers who have been reworking the feminine archetypes through their fiction. She cites people like Carmen Maria Machado, who's really having a moment right now, and Madeline Miller. But feminist retellings complicate familiar stories, she says, specifically this book, because it has an inverted approach. It starts off with these relatable characters that are kind of, quote, neighborhood witches, but it doesn't do what would be typical of a feminist telling, this is what you were talking about earlier, essentially, like the revenge fantasy. The house in a feminist retelling would be like a prison, and the women would be trapped there, and they would want to get out of it at the end. They would want to liberate themselves from it.
And so the feminist retelling that you're describing is the recovery of a sort of corrupted female archetype from a male-centric rendition of it. So, like, the free and powerful female shaman. You mean a witch, right? And sort of reclaiming that. But what Jackson did with We Have Always Lived in the Castle is sort of reinvented the witch and gave us a way to see how it was okay for them to be witchy and continue to be witchy.
Yeah, I think something that like doesn't seem to get talked about a lot with this story, but which I felt like the book and the film adaptation did a good job of. This is an origin story for a small town's like boogeyman. This is little kids growing up in this small town thinking this house is haunted and going up there and daring each other to look in the windows
and sing a song like a Candyman style, say it into the mirror, see if you can stand to be close to the haunted place. What happened to them? Where are they?
And this is the sort of honest story of how the house got to be that way and why the town treats it as such. One of the things that I think is just delicious, no pun intended, inversion of the revenge thing is that all the townspeople continually bring them food every week, in penance for what they did. Yeah.
So and what they did was they once the fire that Mary Cat sets to get Charles out of the house becomes a uncontrollable blaze that has to be put out by the fire department, the fire chief takes off his official hat and then throws a rock through the window. He becomes once again just a citizen, and they destroy the house.
Yeah.
Tracy says, in this subverted fairy tale, the women's happy ending is not liberating themselves from the home and joining society, but living independently outside of society. The full rejection by the town actually puts them in a better place. They're now living on the moon as voluntary outcasts in a happy place.
That's how they imagine it. That's a metaphor throughout the book. And I think that makes the witch thing a little bit more obvious than at the end, right? Like, here's this girl who's just obsessive compulsive and she's burying all this stuff in her yard. It's not like she has like a spell book or anything. She's just like doing whatever she can to keep her fragmented mind from stressing out anymore. And that turns into people literally thinking she's a witch living in a haunted house.
When she's just a murderer hiding from the town.
She's a child murderer. So that brings us to talking about the themes other than the feminism behind this book. I think there is a big theme of persecution of otherness here, which is something that is, again, like a big theme in Jackson's larger work. And then there's the agoraphobia stuff. So let's see how much of that we can unpack. I want to start with this academic article by Marissa Silver. She said that Jackson's work is thought of as either gothic or psychological horror, but that you could argue that the genre assignments, those are apt, but that what we're really looking for in this work is she takes the things that we cherish: community, familial devotion, a love of nature, our mind's ability to transfigure tragedy into life. All of those things are turned into something treacherous in her work, and they sit on top of this what Silver calls a fault line created by ambivalence, right? Which is, again, this is another like why horror argument that she's taking the things that we think of as being the best things in life, and whether or not this is a negative outlook or not, she's finding ways in order to distort those to make us confront things about our community and society that we normally don't want to.
Yeah, and Silver makes a very explicit case that this is the family traditions as sort of channels of horror. Yeah. She says, families agree on certain stories as foundational myths, which can create prisons of untruth. With a slippery and cunning hand, Jackson underscores this idea in the very structure of her novel, which plays out as a sinister fairy tale. The poison in the sugar bowl, the arrival of the disruptive stranger who is a monster in disguise, the darkness that lurks inside the seemingly charming cottage, the mistaken identities, the moral and actual conflagration, meaning that this is all like a funhouse mirror version of, tell me that story about that night. Tell us what you said. Hey, how did things used to be? What's our daily routine? What does this family do? Mary Cat, Constance, and Uncle Julian are all doing that in a twisted, unhealthy way. And the mysterious stranger who comes doesn't actually put things out of place or out of joint that needs to then be recovered for the story to end well. Charles's arrival sets them on a path to completing the process of being disrupted and chaotic and become a haunted house, which is actually better for them.
Yeah. It's interesting. They were in this like weird fugue state until he arrived.
And the other part of, here's another thing that kind of follows that same path.
Yeah.
When the town completely embodies their sort of persecution, when they go from, instead of just being like passive aggressive when Mary Cat's in town or singing that song and avoiding her glances, like when they come up and they break their house and tear up their furniture and keep chanting, let it burn, let it burn. When they finally reach that apotheosis of their persecution of the Blackwoods' otherness, they then get guilty and begin to support the haunted house, support the witches who are hiding in the house, bringing them food so they don't have to come to the town, and saying they're sorry.
Yeah, there's an interesting inversion of food, how food is presented in this, right? Because we know the inciting incident is someone poisoned the food, and Constance is assumed to be the one who did it, and yet through the entire novel, she's cooking and preparing food for people and putting it in front of them, and they eat it without even really, batting an eye. And then that gets turned around, and other people who hate them are preparing food for them without poisoning it and leaving it for them. It's stuff like that that's just like, wow, this book is sharp. So there's an intro. I don't know if it was in your version, but it's in the Penguin Classics one that I got, that Jonathan Lethem wrote. And he talks about how it's pretty obvious that the town in this is supposed to be North Bennington, Vermont, where Jackson and her husband lived, and that the frustrations that they had because of anti-intellectualism and anti-Semitism are expressed in here with the sort of like witchy stuff and the classism stuff. And he points out, he says, there's a vast intimacy of everyday evil that shows up in the book, and that intimacy affects both the village, the family, and the self. And that in this book, there's this exploration between the love and devotion that you see between Maricat and Constance, but that Constance also has this, what is called here, a complete absence of judgment about both her sister and her crime, and it's treated as being absolutely normal. Constance is so crazy. Like, she goes through this entire trial where she's accused of being the murderer, never once says it was my sister, even though she knows the whole time it was, and then goes on to continue living with her sister. And it's not until this other inciting incident this fire that she finally breaks, and she's like, yeah, I know you did it.
Yeah,
But
and
she-
I'm sorry I brought it up. I don't mean to hurt you.
Yeah, in the film, she says, we'll never talk about this again. And my wife turned to me and she was like, that is so your family. Like that there are these inciting incidents, and then the entire family agrees, like, we will never talk about this.
So I think that moment of your wife saying, that is so your family, that is what Shirley Jackson books, and this one in particular, are all about. Mm-hmm. When you can recognize in the midst of this gothic story, this horror story, some quality that you see in yourself, it's like a spine straightener. Like, oh dear.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I need to think about this. You know, it's fuel for reflection. And if you were a person like the townspeople, if you were the kind of person who might think, I'll definitely throw a rock through that window if I ever get a chance, you might find yourself rethinking the source of that once you read this book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's two other reappraisals here of Jackson's work. The first comes from Joyce Carol Oates, who wrote an article that we'll have a link to in here. But Franklin, the biographer of Shirley Jackson, actually interviewed and quoted Joyce Carol Oates on this, who says Jackson was a, quote, consummate pro, and that because she had all of these incredible disparate works, that's what made them powerful in their own ways. And this is, again, like another reasoning for like why the literary establishment didn't know what to do with her, because they were like, well, this book isn't like the other books.
Yeah, what's she trying to do? She keeps changing her whole artistic project.
Yeah. They also cite Elaine Showalter here, who I am familiar with for two reasons. I believe Elaine Showalter is a revered women's studies professor. She is also, I think, the mother of Michael Showalter from The State.
Yeah.
So Elaine Showalter says that Jackson is imaginative and innovative, and yet this was a time when women like her were going mad because they were imprisoned in their kitchens. And yet here she was writing a marvelous Gothic fantasy. Showalter also wrote that today, despite praise from people like Stephen King and Joyce Carol Oates, that Jackson is still underrated and excluded from the library of canon.
It's the tension between the two versions of Shirley Jackson. Right?
Yeah.
Now we're outside of her. People are seeing her as a failed writer because she could not transcend her housewifeness, or an extraordinary, unappreciated writer who was doing the work that people thought she was not doing.
Yeah, it's really remarkable on two different levels. Like the work that Jackson was doing inside the text of this novel is remarkable, and then the lack of work that I guess the literary establishment was doing in terms of understanding her and her project and how it related both to storytelling but also to feminist activity. It's kind of a fascinating like look back at not a terribly long time ago where we were getting it really wrong.
Yeah. So let's go back to Savoy to get a kind of summation of the larger work. Savoy writes, I would describe this tendency in Jackson's work as her compulsion to suggest or to glance at the dire potentiality for everyday life to spiral irrevocably out of control and to collapse around us. It's almost like that particular idea is too close to what women were trying to deal with in terms of feminism for folks to recognize that Jackson was talking about everybody.
And I think here we are again in 2020, situating this episode a week after the coronavirus thing has really exploded. I'm sure this is going to be a moment in history that we all look back on like 9/11 or JFK's assassination as being one of those like, do you remember what that was like? Because it is like I think what we're going through right now is like a traumatic event in slow motion for everyone.
It's mental trauma, but also the actual processes of society are taking a hit, are being traumatized.
Yep.
The supply chain, for instance, is fucked, right?
Right.
And,
yeah.
And the gig economy and the service economy are all revealing their knife edge margin and their inability to, survive without some kind of, I don't want to say extraordinary help because that seems like a different idea, but survive without some kind of planned help.
Yeah.
We cannot let all of these people go hungry,
a social safety
businesses collapse, right? Just because there is a dip in how the world is working.
I mean, this is outside of the episode, but I have been surprised, and I suspect I will continue to be surprised over the next couple of weeks at how many conservative politicians have suddenly embraced what they would refer to as socialist policies because of the circumstances that we're under right now. And that's Savoy's point about Jackson, getting back to Jackson. It's the inoculation of horror argument again, right? That she was looking at the world and she was saying, look, this is the potential for everyday life to go completely out of control. And I'm going to imagine it. And we're all going to, you can come celebrate this imagination with me in my book so that we can prepare ourselves for when it actually does happen.
And something that Joyce Carol Oates points out in her appreciation of Jackson, that the happy ending, in particular, We Have Always Lived in the Castle, but also most of Jackson's work, the happy ending is happy for some, and not for others. The way that life continues or is returned to its natural state, its acceptable state, actually does leave some people in a terrible situation. Jackson was not writing fantastical literature that helped you understand, like, oh, this is how we can slay the dragon and return home changed, but now able to deal with the world different. It was about changes in the world, the trauma of feminism, to the quote unquote natural state of things in the household, the trauma of mental illness, anxiety and agoraphobia, or the trauma of drug addiction. You don't then get rid of it and return back to how everything was cool before.
Right, those traumas were coping with the sort of invisible pressures of society that they were under in the first place. Why would you go back to that? And it doesn't make any sense.
They're blowing up things that were unsustainable.
Yeah.
So Oates said that We Have Always Lived in the Castle becomes a New England fairy tale of the more wicked variety, in which a happy ending is both ironic and literal, the consequence of unrepentant witchcraft and a terrible sacrifice of others. Which, Chris, sounds a little bit like capitalism.
I think it maybe sounds like that to us at this extreme moment in time. Yeah, I don't know that this was what Shirley Jackson ever envisioned, but it certainly feels like it's resonant. You've been listening to Super Context, a podcast autopsy of media.
How it's made and how it informs our everyday culture.
Our theme music is Human Factor by Mile Marker.
And right now you're listening to Drive Fast by 3 Chain Links.
Show notes and all our past episodes are available at supercontextpodcast.libsyn.com.
You can email the show at supercontextpodcast@gmail.com to tell us what you like, what you don't like, and to suggest topics for future shows.
And I'm available on Twitter as @ChristianSager.
And I'm there @Bennett Radio. 2 N's, 2 T's.